Hi, my name is Brittany Cease. Some of you may remember me from the Attorneys for Justice March held back in June, where I was amongst other members of the Tri-County Bar Associations, elected officials, community leaders, and local law enforcement standing in solidarity for equality and justice. On that hot day on Thursday in June, I asked an assembled crowd if justice was blind. Of course, it was a rhetorical question. I challenged us all to foster environments that actually stood for justice for all and to turn rhetorical commitments into daily practices. That day, we acknowledged existing issues of racial injustice. And now the task before us, I believe, is to continue civil discourse, to listen, understand each other, and most importantly, to move forward together towards solutions. I'm a member of the board of directors for the Charleston Forum, and I'm humbled to be introducing you to the Forum's latest project involving a survey conducted in early May, where Charleston area residents were asked to rank race relations in the Low Country and to pose solutions aimed at improving inequality. So let's go right ahead and get started. Welcome, and hopefully welcome back to our virtual programming in 2020. First things first, I'd like to thank our sponsors since our June event. Those include Charleston County Bar Association, Motley Rice Law Firm, Henry and Sylvia Yasik Foundation. And please note that sponsors are the only way we can continue our work in the community. So please share our mission and link on our website with any potential sponsors. And please consider becoming one yourself if you're able. Now on to the virtual event tonight. As many of you may know, the Forum commissioned a survey of Tri-County residents' views on issues of race and policing and criminal justice, education, economics, and the future of the past. You might have seen some of the in-depth coverage of the results in several Post and Courier stories. You can view this full survey under the 2020 drop-down menu on the website. So after those survey results were completed by the Forum, we decided to take those survey results to the community and to the policymakers in our community. We're focusing now on one topic each month. We're going out to the community, we're interviewing community members, asking for their thoughts on the survey as well, other solutions that they might want to propose. And we're asking you guys, if you ever want to be one of those community members giving us input, please let us know at info@thecharlestonforum.com. And so after we have that feedback and we're doing these interviews, we're taking those survey results and the community questions that you guys offer and the proposals that you guys pose to us, we're taking those to the policymakers to get their reactions and ideas for what will or will not work, and how the community can bring those proposals to fruition. Please keep in mind when viewing the survey that one significant takeaway is the acknowledgement as a community, I think, an overall agreement that improvement is needed. Of course, we don't know how. We want to know where to start and how we can be a part of bettering our community. Keep in mind that no one person will have all of the solutions, but by working together, we can begin to uncover them. So without further ado, I'm excited to start this month with policing and criminal justice, and to be joined by chiefs of police in the city of Charleston and the city of North Charleston. Thank you, Chief Reynolds and Chief Burgess, for joining us tonight. And as always, proud to have President of MDC, John Simpkins, moderate our discussions. John, thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you, Brittany. And I appreciate that introduction and context setting for what I hope will be a useful and productive and illuminating conversation with the chiefs, with Chief Reynolds and Chief Burgess. We're glad to have them with us today. And what I'd like to do before we get into the survey results, because those are going to guide some of our discussion today, is to just hear briefly from Chief Burgess and from Chief Reynolds. Tell us a little bit about what's on your mind. You know, today it's unfortunately it's in the aftermath of another police-involved shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin, the shooting of Jacob Blake. The last report is that he is likely to be paralyzed and won't regain the ability to walk. That has, of course, spurred protests against that shooting, and 2 individuals have been killed and another wounded in the aftermath of that. So I wanted to hear from each of you as we enter into this conversation regarding the greater Charleston community. What's on your mind as we start today? So Chief Burgess, we hear from you first, please.
I'd like to thank you guys for allowing me to be on the program, and I just really want to do the Lord's will. That's my whole makeup. You know, I've been a chief for going on 3 years now, and I've been a police officer for the city of North Charleston all 31 of my years of service. My main mission as the leader of the police department is to basically find a way to work within my agency internally so we can provide externally a better service to our community. I want a partnership with the community. I want to build a relationship with the community, fellowship with the community, friendship, any kind of ship that we can ride on to make it right. I want to ride on that ship. And I feel that the Lord's giving me this opportunity to lead from the front, but then also he's giving me this opportunity that I worked in this department, and I worked as a cop for 31 years. And I know the people that I work with, and I know exactly, basically in a lot of ways, not all, but I kind of have an idea of what we need to do to be better servants. And as you stated about the incidents that have occurred in our nation this year alone, it's unfortunate, it's senseless, and it's not right that these things are occurring. Being an African American, male especially, I grew up in all Black neighborhoods, and I'm there all the time. But the thing about it is that I realize that I'm on my knees every morning. I pray in the evening and I pray at night, and I work with people. I'm not in City Hall, just like Chief Reynolds. He'll tell you crimes don't happen in City Hall. We got to be out in the communities, and we're out in our communities trying to bring peace. But how do we, as law enforcement leaders, how do we strike a balance where we know that there's violence that's in our community that we're trying to prevent or trying to solve? How do we not intermingle sometimes with people who, we may feel that or have the propensity to conduct those violent acts without getting the good fish caught up in the net? That's the thing that I'm working hard at. I don't want to put a net over the community, because I'll get the good fish most often caught up in that net, and then sometimes it can be tragic, as we had with Walter Scott. So that's what I'm looking to do, is trying to find the right way to only deal with those who simply do not want to be civilized.
Thank you, Chief Burgess. Chief Reynolds.
It's a privilege to be a part of this, especially with my brother, Reggie, part of this profession, part of this region, and I'll just say a part of this conversation and this work, this important work. It's, I would say, the most difficult. I've got almost the same amount of time as Reggie, and a lot of similarities. I was from the National Capital Region, just outside of DC. And now I've been the chief here less than 2.5 years, and a similar amount of time in the profession. And there's no question, to me, this is the most difficult and the most challenging time of my career. A lot of the communities that trust us the least are the ones that need us the most. And how do we bridge those gaps? How do we get the best outcomes? How do we treat people with dignity and respect and still be relevant in our communities and not create additional harm while making our communities safe? And the only way we can do that is together. And so I love the Charleston Forum, the work of the forum, what it's trying to accomplish, to bring unity, to bring justice, to bring fairness and equity and better outcomes. And that's what why we join these professions. It's why I'm still doing what I do, passionate about it. And it is not easy. It's a very, very painful time in our nation, in our region, in our cities. And so this is an important conversation that everyone should be engaged in.
Thank you, Chief Reynolds. And I appreciate your highlighting this conversation and where we want to take our time together this afternoon. It's going to be a conversation that's centered on the community. It is going to be informed by the community. There are already questions in the Q&A, so keep them coming. If you have them, we'll turn to those shortly. But what I want to do first is share with everyone some of the findings from the survey that Brittany mentioned, and specifically findings that relate to race relations, to policing, and to criminal justice. And after I do that, I'm going to follow up with some questions for each of you. And it's really always intended to be a discussion. And as you have questions for each other, please feel free to engage in a dialogue among yourselves. So with that, I'll move into the summary of findings. This is taken from the survey that was conducted in March. And the first worth highlighting is one that relates to quality of life and standard of living. And if we look at that slide, we'll see that across the region, Charleston, Dorchester, and Berkeley counties, residents rate their quality of life really highly. The composite score there between whites and blacks, very good and good, is 89.8%. So people like living in Charleston. That's not a surprise. People like living in the Low Country, and that's not a surprise. As we look deeper into that and consider how race relations are conducted, what's worth pointing out here, I think, is over the past 10 years, if we look at race relations, we see a composite score that says 25.6% of the respondents say they've declined or remain the same and are poor. And among African Americans in particular, 36.7% say that they have declined or they stayed the same or are poor, so that there has been no improvement over the last 10 years. As we look at policing, I think the two areas worth highlighting here are the question involving whether most law enforcement officers racially profile when deciding to stop motorists. 73.5% of Black respondents said yes. 40.6% of white respondents said yes. So that gap there of 32.9% among respondents reflecting a low composite score. Less than half of the respondents would say that police officers profile motorists, but almost 3/4 of Black respondents would say that that's the case. On issues of criminal justice, fines, fees, bail amounts, and time away from work, financial impacts of involvement with the criminal justice system. If those things should be taken into consideration, there's a gap of 12%. African Americans strongly or somewhat agree that with a responding rate of 76.5%, that those things should be taken into account. Whites believe that at a rate of about 64.5%. So looking at the financial impact of engagement with the criminal justice system. And then the last one, or the last few that I want to pay attention to here, are notions of trust, trust in police officers. Again, the racial disparity, the gap in respondents is large here, 26.1%. Low trust, fewer than half of Black respondents have levels of trust in the police department, strong trust in the police department, and over half of the white respondents have levels of strong trust in the police department. When we look at little to no trust, then those numbers are reversed, with blacks indicating little to no trust at higher rates than whites, with again a gap of 23.4%. Trust in the judicial system, trust in juries, trust in these systemic parts of the criminal justice system are all seeing lower rates of trust among Black Americans. And then when we look more generally and compare these to national numbers, the Tri-County Strong Trust Composite Rate actually compares favorably when we talk about police officers to the national poll. And then it's a little bit lower as it relates to trust in the judicial system and trust in juries. So again, those systemic issues that we're concerned about. So Chief Reynolds and Chief Burgess, first of all, I just want to get your impressions overall to these responses that we're seeing, and then I want to follow up with a few questions. As you're looking at this and you see reactions to systemic engagement with the criminal justice system, the impact, the financial impact that engagement may have, and how people see not only police officers but each other. What do you take away from this set of responses that we shared today?
Chief, you go.
Sure. What it shows me is I believe we've come a long ways. We have a long ways to go. It shows me that there's still a great distrust for the police. And I think there's a lot of people that have good reason for that, based on things that have occurred in the past, things that are occurring around our nation. And I think we take some steps forward with technology, training, policies, equipment, a whole lot of different things that have morphed over the years. But what this shows to me is there's disparities in how, especially based on race lines, how the African American community has such a high level of distrust. I think one of the areas where there was a big difference is I know someone who has experienced abuse by police officers. And there was a much greater number among the African American responses, as a much smaller number with the white responses. And so when we look at the communities that we are often in, the areas where we have a lot of our violent crime and where we do a lot of our police work, that becomes even a greater concern. So we have a lot of work to do.
Yes, I actually concur with the chief. It is very, very sad to see the numbers displayed the way they are. And you're talking about, he's been in law enforcement longer than I have, and he's seen a whole lot more than I've actually seen, and especially because he came from a bigger state when you talk about population wise. And I look at it as just like he's looking at it, but I'm saying to myself, like, we in this point in time in 2020, we have a whole lot more African Americans and Hispanics that are working in law enforcement now, versus back in the 60s. And it's really sad because, it seems like you think that we would be making incremental, changes and going a little further up the ladder to equality for all. But these numbers indicate that it doesn't matter what year you ask about the criminal justice system and statement, trust and confidence, it seems like it's going to always be that way. And I guess the sad part for me, and I know for Chief Reynolds, is that all the hard work that we do, when are we going to see that turn? Because like we had with Mr. George Floyd, you had 4 officers that perform outside law enforcement. They did the wrong things. But this is the only profession where, that those officers did it in Minneapolis, but all officers who most of us are good, law-abiding, and faithful people, we have to be held responsible for all of that. And it seemed like all of the good money we placed into our community banks in Charleston and in North Charleston, when an event occurred, even if it happens here or in Minnesota, it's all wiped out. And we have to start back over again. And it's disheartening that we see it that way, because it seems like every time we meet a citizen, we open up our hearts and our minds. So we, and most of all, to prove to them that we are the servants of them. And it's really, really sad to see those numbers, because we want, that's what we look for. We gauge the work that we do every day to see how well we can be better at our jobs. And these numbers are proving different.
Chief Reynolds, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought I heard you say in your opening remarks that this is something to the effect of, this is as bad as you've seen it, or it's as challenging a time as you've had in your career. You've each served for somewhere around 30 years, if not longer. What is it, and this isn't just a question for Chief Reynolds, it's for either or both of you. What is it about this time that makes it more difficult, if you do believe that that's the case?
I'll speak, and I'm sure Reggie's got his perspectives as well, and I know he's been through some very challenging times, but this year in particular, we started with the COVID, and there's not been a second, a minute, an hour, a day that the officers haven't been the front line, right? A lot of people have stayed home, a lot of people have adjusted their work habits, a lot of businesses have closed. A lot of government services have been kind of pulled back, but the police have never slowed down. In fact, our guys, the men and women that work in our agencies, they haven't taken any leave, and they're in harm's way. And then on top of that, we had the civil unrest here on the 30th, the 31st, very violent, and it was an attack really to some degree on our communities and the police. Then on top of that, we have protests. We have right now, the difference, the divide between the DNC and the RNC. And then on top of that, we've had an increase in violence, and we've seen young people in our communities. I mean, I've been on the crime scenes. I know Reggie's been on all of them. And there's no way you'll ever get used to seeing young people's lives lost and hearing mothers' voices cry in the night, and just making those notifications. And when you put that whole package together and you look at the division in our nation right now, the police are right in the center of that. And so it's painful, because most of the men and women in this profession, they come to be selfless, to be committed to making a difference. I talk about, my definition of a leader is leave it better than how you found it. Most police officers have their 4-year college degrees here. Many of them have their advanced degrees. And they work hard to try to master their craft, to learn the law, to navigate being a good police officer. And they are right now being vilified. And they are, and this data shows very clearly. I don't question this data, by the way. I think it's spot on. And so we have to face that. We have to embrace that. We have to lean into that, and we have to do better. But it's hard. I guess that's just, it's painful. It hurts. We feel the pain of our community members. I feel the pain of the African American community here, but I'll tell you, I think they're one of our biggest supporters. They just want us to get it right. They want us in their communities, but they want to be treated with dignity and respect, and they want us to get it right. They demand that. They want justice. They want a transparency. They want accountability. They want the right outcomes, but they want us in their communities. I'm not hearing most people in our communities that are experiencing violence and other challenges to say, hey, we don't want the police here. The biggest request I get, and I know Reggie's the same way because we talk all the time, is we want more police. We want police on foot. We want them on bicycles. We want them on mounted patrols. I hear that all the time. We want them to roll their windows down. We want them to actually engage with us in a meaningful relationship. We want to know who they are. We want them talking to our kids. We want them out there playing basketball and doing things to where we actually can see them as a face and a person, not just a cop coming in and arresting people. And so I just, this time in 2000, I've never experienced this tempo. The operational tempo right now is so much. It's stressful. I heard somebody use the term debilitating recently, and I would actually agree with that at
Yeah.
times.
I mean, Chief is 100% right. I don't really have too much to offer other than from a point of view as an African American, he's 100% right. This profession itself lends us the opportunity to go out and protect and serve the community. And sometimes when we're out here trying to protect and serve the community, this sometimes once in a while we're going to get it wrong. And when we get it wrong, it's devastating for all of us. But when we look at the overall outlook of what law enforcement is trying to do, we can see all those good officers out there, going and working in schools, not because they're in the school to try to harm a child, it's because they're trying to keep a child safe. They're working in the neighborhoods, not because they're trying to profile or stereotype somebody. They're trying to make sure that Ms. Thelma or Mr. Clay's house is not burglarized. They're working on the streets, riding the streets, not because they're trying to look for somebody that they think may be looking dirty because the color of their skin or what kind of hair that they have, but they're looking at the people who they just got a call from a young man who's parked at Leeds in Dorchester and said that a white vehicle just shot at his vehicle and we can look at the bullet holes in it. So our officers, 99% of the day, are out here trying to keep peace in our communities, trying to serve our citizens. And you're right. I mean, it sometimes it goes to the other side and it's wrong, 100% wrong when it happens, but that is not what our intentions are. When Michael Slager shot Walter Scott, I was the last commander who actually got to that scene. So Slager had already left. So when I got there, the chief at the time, Chief Briggs, told me what Slager told him. So as a police officer, I have certain equipment on my belt. So I'm out there trying to, protect the law and do what the law says that I need to do. So when you are under arrest, I'm sorry, some people just don't, want to be arrested, and I can understand that. So what Slager told Chief Briggs was that, Walter Scott took his taser and pointed his taser at him and fired it at him. So he had no choice but to engage him in that manner. Now, I wouldn't want anybody to die at all as a result of law enforcement, doing their jobs. But when he said that, I said, well, if that's what he said, then that's the only person we've got the information from. We did not know anything about that until we received the video that Monday morning. And we saw the video, and the video showed us the truth. And we responded and reacted to that truth. But the mayor fired him, and the mayor asked SLED to charge him with murder. And we learned a whole lot from that. But the thing about it is that one individual and that one event itself defined us as an agency. And like Chief Reynolds says, every day from 2015 to probably 2017, 18, our officers go out when they get called to a home because a lady's calling us to say that her husband's beating on her. We get called to a store, folks are shoplifting in the store. We get called to a mall, young men saying other men were shooting at them. And we get there, the officers are trying to serve the citizens, and sometimes they are called, well, I don't trust y'all. Y'all look like the Slager type guys. Our officers got beat up about that for many, many years, but they stayed on the job and tried to do the job that they swore to do. So sometimes when we go through these situations, it really brings us down, and we have to work within ourselves as well as the faith-based people to help pick us up, because the people expect us. That radio never stopped during Walter Scott shooting, and the radio hasn't stopped since, because the majority of people in these communities need law enforcement because they need to live in peace.
So Chief Burgess, I want to follow up on that. And you mentioned that you're from the community that you serve. That's right. So as you're looking for new officers, are you trying to put people in communities that look like them? Are you trying to put people in communities that are familiar to them? How do you decide where people go as they're trying to do their jobs?
I work on a two-tier type approach. John, ever since I've been a cop, the people that come to City Hall to file a complaint on a police officer, they come to the second floor, the police administration. And they walk through that door, they want to speak to internal affairs. Ever since I've been a police officer for 31 years, the majority of people like your data, those folks that come here to file complaints are African American, look just like me. So when I lived through all I lived through as a cop, I saw all my predecessors, all the way from Chief Watley, Chief Caldwell, Chief Zumo, Chief Dreggers. I learned good and bad from all of them. And one thing that stuck in my heart and my mind was, how do I, as a chief, reduce those complaints? So what I did first, and believe it or not, U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions told me this. When I met him in 2017, I asked him, you know, Attorney General, I need to turn this thing around. I needed to work out where the citizens understand, they can see that we are there for their betterment. He told me, he says, Burgess, he says, you need to work on, your department need to work on partnership. He told me that. Jeff Sessions told me that in 17. And he says, because at the time we were looking at reduction of violent crime. So he said, work on your partnership. So that was my number one thing, because I wanted to do that. So the first thing I said, John, was the people that come in here to complain are African Americans. How do I give my officers tools that they can use to understand the African American culture? I went in and I called a young lady named Stacey Beard from Boston. She came in here and taught unconscious bias base. I got Senator Tim Scott, worked on fair and partial police training. Then I actually got with the YWCA last year in 2019 and this year to bring in racial equity. What I'm trying to do is, I saw the problems, John, a long time. So how do we work on that? Because if I give the officers, that majority of my officers are Caucasians, if I give all my officers, and I can give them information and train them in how to interact in the culture that I'm from, then when they respond to that call, they can really serve the people without the folks thinking that they're looking down on them, or they're trying to stereotype them, or trying to profile them. So that was the thing. Now the recruiting side is this. John, you know as well as I know, you African-American male. If I would ask you to put a lie detector test on you right now and say to you, how often did your father, your grandfather say to you, John, I want you to be a police officer when you grow up? Zero. See, that's the truth. That's in most of our homes. None of us in our neighborhoods, my father, who worked at the paper mill for 28 years at West Vehicle, loved society, but he never talked about my brothers or I being in law enforcement. The best recruiters, John, are the citizens, but they won't recruit, John, unless we show them that we are better to them. So we're in our communities, and now we got people in the community saying, I know a kid that want to be a cop or thinking about being a cop. Where is he? Where is she? We go to them, talk to them. You know, we send young, white, young, black, male and female officers over there. Why? Because I'm 55 years old. You know, the things that they talk about now, I can't do it. So you work on a two-tier thing, John. You understand your problem. The problem is relationships with our black community. That's a generational thing. You work on that. You give your officers better training so they can speak with African Americans, Hispanics, so they won't feel like they're being belittled. And then you work on the recruitment part, and then eventually you can turn it around. But it's going to take a while to do it.
Thank you. So Chief Reynolds, I want to put a similar question to you. If you looked at the findings on race relations and you put those together with those who had knowledge of someone who had been abused by the police and trust in the police, it creates a big challenge for police departments to engage with communities of color, and specifically with African American communities. What does your department do along those same lines of unconscious bias training, equity training? How are you equipping your officers to go out into the community that you serve?
So we do all of those same trainings, and we, like North Charleston, we far exceed all the minimum training standards. And I think there's a few things that we can do to try to create a better outcome. One is we hire the right people. We create a culture of accountability, and we're always investing in their training. It doesn't ever end. It starts with who we hire and their entrance level training. But if somebody has a 25-year career, they're just beginning to learn with entrance level. And I'll actually, I teach, and I'm sure Reggie's taught most of his career, and I love teaching at the academy. I'll write on a board, I'll say, here's all the things that you learn in the academy: driving, physical training, defensive tactics, constitutional law, criminal law, traffic law, man, I could go on, report writing, all those things. And interspersed in there is interpersonal communication skills. And I'll say, what's the most important thing on this board right now? You explain to me why. And most people get, it's interpersonal communication skills. It's a gift of gab. It's a sense of humor. And not everybody has that skill. And like Reggie was saying, if you put a white person who's never been in the African-American community and you put them out there and you say, hey, you've had your entrance level training, now go at it, good luck. One of the complaints that we get from the African-American community it often is, this person doesn't know how to relate. They don't understand our culture. They don't understand our history. They get intimidated. They're afraid. They're too quick to fight or argue or whatever. They don't know how to relate to us. And I think that's a valid complaint. And I think it's something that we continue to understand better now. And we are working hard on. So when you say, what are the training programs? Those are some of the training with bias. But I'll tell you, one of the things that Reggie and I have talked a lot about is trying to have more regional training here. So that I'll just give you one example, diversity training. Instead of having somebody in Columbia who maybe has never even stepped foot in the city of Charleston or North Charleston and never been in the Low Country, teaching to the entire state of 300 agencies, somebody in our region can talk about the slave mart and the slave museum. They can talk about the hanging trees. They can talk about the history and the roots of slavery in the city of Charleston. They can talk about gentrification. They can talk about Michael Slager and Walter Scott and Mother Emanuel. And then all of a sudden, it becomes real. It becomes tangible. It affects our outcomes. It affects our mindset and how we empathize and how we can better communicate with, and specifically be better listeners and treat people with dignity and respect. And so when you talk about training, those are the things that we're working on, and we're doing those things now here. But I can tell you, Reggie and I have talked a lot about when you talk about community policing, which we embrace the idea of it, but how do you define that? Well, it's solving problems. Well, how do you solve problems? You have to have a relationship with the people that you serve. You have to be a part of the community, which is what Reggie's been talking about. And so how do we engage in that work? Well, you're not just born with those skills. Some people have the gift of gab. Some people have a really good way of communicating with people, but most people have to work on that. So we invest in that with our entrance level training, with our block training, with our annual training. We're doing a lot with leadership development. Our first line supervisors, how do we help them have that mindset of problem solving and relational policing? And it really is the culture. And I mentioned that, having a culture of accountability. It's easy to do policies and throw those out on the table. It's not easy to necessarily impact behavior and our attitudes and our outcomes and how we treat people. And so we have to invest in that. It has to come from the top down, from the bottom up. It has to be at each level of our command and throughout our organization. And it has to be manifested in outcomes, frankly, metrics, just like what you're showing us, this dialogue today. These metrics are real. We can't just ignore these things. These are real, they're important. It's a part of our national narrative, and it's a part of our narrative here. And unless we're willing to dive into this conversation in very tangible ways, and part of that is the training, the question you asked. Being able to have those conversations throughout our organization on a regular basis. Why do these things happen? And I talk about in our command meetings regularly. Stop telling me everything's great, everything's okay, because it's not. The minute that we acknowledge that is the minute that we begin to get better. We begin to make changes. We begin to make improvements. And there's not an organization, and Reggie's been on a lot of sports teams. He has great sports analogies. There's not a team on this planet that doesn't have room for improvement. And so we acknowledge that often, especially in training with our policies, who we're hiring, how we're developing our supervisors, our promotional process, all those things.
I appreciate hearing from both of you the importance of narrative, and whether it's a local narrative or a national narrative, and the need to sometimes change that narrative. If we think about the current national narrative, one piece of that is the talk. It is the conversation that a parent has to have with typically their son, but we could extend that. I mean, there are women who are victims of excessive force from police officers as well, and that narrative is one that you may expect to encounter the use of excessive force if you engage with police officers. What are your departments doing? What happens if an officer is determined to have used excessive force? What happens to him or her? And how do you handle those situations when they occur in your departments?
Well, I'll say this right here. We had a situation that we had a shots fired call that led our officers over to a hotel in North Charleston. And we saw the vehicle that fit the description that was shooting a weapon outside the window. And when we got there, the vehicle had stopped and two males ran out of the car and went to a hotel. And so our officers actually, followed behind them, but they actually proceeded, in caution. And as they proceeded in there, they spoke to the clerk, and the clerk stated to them who were the two, or one of the individuals that was running past the door, because it was so dynamic that, when you go into a store or go into a hotel, the doors automatically open up as the motion sensor comes, picks up your body. Well, these guys were in such of a hurry to get into that hotel to get away from law enforcement that they pried the doors open and they ran on upstairs. So the clerk recognized one, and she told us who lived in the room. So we actually cleared the hotel bottom level, because none of the rooms were open in the bottom level, just I think the second floor. And to get to that part is that one of our officers, while we were pulling everybody out the room had, I think, around probably like 12 to 13 young men in the room. So of course we were in the governor's orders of, social distancing at that time. So we ordered everybody out, hands up, place everybody on the floor so we can search them for weapons and then start to figure out what's going on. One of the young men there was a grandson of the former Mr. Lewis, who was a city councilman from the city of Charleston. And in the video, you can see my officer trying to actually place this young man down, and his use of force was not consistent with our policy manual at all. So, I reached out because we didn't get a complaint on it. The young man hadn't come in. So we reached out to some folks to see if they knew who he was. And then we got some calls from the former council member. Now we knew who it was. So, I actually just kind of narrated the stop, because what was said to the civil rights groups was that we profiled this young man because we had stopped him a night prior to that. Well, if you look at the video, he was stopped in the southern part of the city, which is almost 20-something miles away from the actual hotel. And it was a day before that. Well, it was 2 days before that. So the officers in the southern part of the city were not the officers involved with the hotel incident. So they didn't know this young man at all. It's that he was stopped in a car. So when it happened, I looked at the videotape, as I always do with my internal affairs and the commanders. And we opened up our policy manual. And we opened up an investigation. and I instructed them to proceed with investigation and actually call the family members of that young man to advise them that we were going to be having an eye investigation. Then we found out that he used tactics that's not in our policy when you use that level of force, because the first level of the matrix is conversation. And then if I can't get you to comply, then I would actually raise my voice, or the next level would be, light hands, where you're under arrest. After you're told you're under arrest, we want you to turn around, put your hands behind your back. Then it goes up to the next level. So his level was way above the level that it should have been. So he was actually, he actually was reprimanded, and he actually received punishment from that. And not only that, I had him to go through some training that was intensive critical incident training, and through a outside source, to actually have them to talk about what he experienced. What has he learned from that? And did he see, when he was involved in that situation, was it something that he, as a police officer, felt that he was wrong when he was doing it, or afterwards? And that officer took it in a good manner, and he actually he took his punishment, and he knew he was wrong, and he admitted that. Now, back in the past, John, when an officer may have done something, and we wrote him up, and he may have gotten punishment, whatever. But the piece that I, as a commander, as a chief, felt that we need, if an officer does something wrong, but it's not egregious enough for termination, we will punish him, but we need to build him back up. We need to get him to understand what he did wrong by policy, and to actually get him someplace with a professional to help him understand what he did and build him back up, so he can understand that if this happens, if this event comes again before him, this is not the level of force that I need to use. So therefore, you can put him back into the community, and then you have him working with some of the civic club presidents that talked with him and kept him focused and said, listen, you'll get officer, you made a mistake, you learn from it, you actually not only got punished, but you got some help, and to bring him back around and get him back out here, because most officers are doing the right thing. So what I'm saying to you, basically, what we do, if it's not egregious, we make sure that we investigate it properly. The outcome, find out the outcome, progressively discipline them, and we make sure we provide services to actually get them to understand what they did wrong, so they can be better than they were before.
So I got a follow-up question,
Yeah.
and thank you for that explanation, Chief Burgess. Each of you, when something like this happens, you're going to be the first person that the media turn to, and they're going to want a reaction. They're going to want a response. What do you do when faced with a request to speak to an incident where you may not know all the facts? It involves one of your people, and you need to balance between taking care of your people as well as taking care of your community. How do you respond in the moment when you're asked to give a comment or speak to a situation like this?
If you don't mind, Luther, I'm gonna kind of hit him real quick on this one. I had a situation, it's gonna be real quick, John, where we had a shooting in the community. Our officers were there. There was a video placed out that was recorded by a citizen, and the video showed this young man being shot. The young lady screamed in the background and said, "Oh my goodness, they shot him. He didn't do anything. Why would they do that to him?" That video went viral. So what I did as a commander, I was in church. I left church. I went to the crime scene right then. I spoke to all officers there briefly and said, "Can you tell me where you're at?" And they told me. And all the officers said, "Chief, we didn't do it. He did it himself." So the timing, like you said, the clock is ticking. So what I did, because I learned from not only Walter Scott, I learned from Snowden, I learned from a lot of things over 31 years. Get in contact with those people who you may not have a good relationship with, but you need to talk with them. And what I'm saying is, some people that other folks in law enforcement may not want to speak to, Luther and I speak to them. You have some of the civil rights leaders like Ms. Dot Scott, Elder Johnson, Nelson Rivers, Pastor Dixon, Shaquem, Kevin from the 100 Men of Charleston. These are all the stakeholders that the community will call before they call anybody else. So you call those individuals and you give them as much as you can give them. And all I did that day, Mr. Simpkins, is said, let me be able to look at the videos and I'll be able to provide you a response as well as the media. And they told me that, Chief, I appreciate you calling me ahead of time because they knew nothing about it. And I said, just give me a little time. And the time that they gave me, I was able to provide them a video so they can see. And I brought them in after I spoke with the father of the young man. He saw the video first and we brought them in and they saw the video for themselves. And they were able to get out ahead of it. So what I'm saying to you, and Luther can tell you, you cannot develop those relationships, Mr. Simpkins, in the crisis moment. You have to develop those relationships now before crisis come. Because if you develop those relationships before crisis come, you can lean or rely on those relationships when crisis is in front of you, and they will help you to manage that.
Thank you. Thank you. Chief Reynolds, you want to jump in on this?
Sure. I would just say, and I agree with everything that Chief Reggie just said, but I would add, it's all about owning it. We have to own it. And I think a lot of what Reggie just said would support that. And this is where the distrust is such a factor, because if there's trust, then there's patience, then they allow us to, the community members and others to hit the pause button and say, we have to figure this out. I have no issue telling the media and the public, I have questions that are not answered yet. And I have the same questions that you have, and I'm going to be investigating, and I'll make sure that as soon as we have the answers, we're going to share those with the public, because the public deserves to know. And that's the whole idea of a transparency and accountability. And so what I have, here's what I'm going to share right now, like Reggie's saying, whether it's with our community members and the key leaders, whether it's with the media. That is why I think right now, and kind of where we started, and I think where this conversation is heading, is we have to communicate, as Reggie said, ahead of time, so that our community members know that we have good policies, that we have body cameras, that we have an audit process, that we're reviewing those body cameras regularly, that we have a good process where when there's a complaint, it's being investigated, and people have confidence that they can go anonymously, they can go online, they can call, they can send an email. They have people that they can access, that they can provide information, and those things are going to be paid attention to. That they can have some level of confidence in their police leadership and their police agencies, that when they provide a complaint, and I'll tell you, one of the things that came out of our audit was, hey, you have this small number of complaints. Well, I'm not saying, hey, that's great. We only got 6 complaints last year. I would actually rather have way more complaints, right? We want people to complain. Because that speaks to trust. If there's no trust, you're not going to get any complaints, because nobody has any confidence that you're going to do anything about it. And we now have a much, much higher number of complaints and compliments. And many of those may not end in a punitive way. It may, like Reggie said, it may be, we call it education-based discipline, or maybe it's a training issue. Maybe it's a failure of a policy. Maybe it's a failure of our equipment. Maybe it's a combination of all those things. But how do we as an organization embrace criticism, embrace complaints and new information that comes in, and somehow we're better and we're different from it? Because the idea is that we're going to improve, that we're going to get better. We're not going to sit here and be defensive and say, hey, we didn't do anything wrong. Because I think in every incident, we can always do something better. Even when we do many things right, there's always areas where we can do better. So I think use of force is something that gets a lot of attention, rightfully so. The rate of use of force is very, very low, thankfully. And so we look at every single incident and say, we have a committee that actually focuses only on use of force. I think they just met a few days ago at our academy. There's a person from policy, from legal, There's a person from our range, from our defensive tactics and interpersonal communications. People that do all the levels of training throughout our organization are on that committee, and they look at duty to intervene. They look at things like less than lethal and all the equipment and different things that we use. And then they look at any incidents that have happened around the country and regionally, and then within our own department, and say, well, what did we do right? What could we have done better or differently? What are things that we can make sure that our officers know so that we can increase their confidence and increase their competence so that we get the best outcomes and we don't have really bad things occurring here. I can't change what happened in Minneapolis. I can't change what happened in Wisconsin. I do have responsibility for the men and women here in my command. And every day, this is a busy city. There's a lot of things going on. Reggie's got tremendous responsibility as we look at things like violent crime and we look at public engagement, public trust. And so use of force is, if you're a chief, use of force, pursuits policies, there's a couple things that you better know backwards and forwards, and you want to look at constantly. And we have something called EPIC that we stole from New Orleans about a year or so ago. Ethical policing is courageous, and it speaks to the duty to intervene. And we do a significant training block with our officers to say, okay, if you see something, you have to say something. That means that we're going to create culture and environment where everybody's okay with another officer telling a partner, hey, you're wrong. You need to stop doing that behavior. I'm physically going to pull you off, and I might save your career. I might save your freedom. I might save your family. And I might save somebody's life. Like in Minneapolis, we talked about that immediately after and said, maybe if somebody would have intervened, George Floyd would still be alive today. Maybe if one of those officers would have done something differently, a supervisor would have stepped in. Why was there not a supervisor on the scene? And we ask ourselves that so that we can learn and we can be better for it. Not to judge what happened, because a lot of times you don't know all the facts. We don't know everything about what happened in Wisconsin, but we do know that we have certain policies, we have certain expectations, and that we can learn and get better. And we need to have those conversations, and we need to be very honest and embrace whatever it is, so that, because our community expects that, right? They demand that, they deserve that, so that in the end, we are that much better each time, and that our communities get the best of us. And that's what they expect. That's what I hear every day from our people.
So I want to follow up on that last comment, Chief Reynolds, and ask you each, with the time that we have left, what's the one thing that you'd want your department to get better at? What's the critical issue that you'd want to improve in with regard to how your department runs, how you engage with the community? What is that one big thing, not a little thing, but a big thing that you'd want to get better at?
I can go. I'll say the very crux of the Charleston Forum, the very crux of the data and the metrics that you've presented today. And that is to improve our relationships with the communities that we serve. We cannot do this job without our community. The police are the community, and the community is us. And how do we build a stronger relationship, a stronger dialogue, a stronger level of communication? It's like a marriage. 1 + 1 can be greater than 2. When you look at how we started this conversation, there's such a divide right now. We don't have that chemistry. We don't have that symmetry. We're not having that. I love the idea of synergy. You know, where in a marriage, a healthy marriage, 1 + 1 is greater than 2. In a healthy community, which is what we want here in Charleston, and we have it in a lot of places, but how do we expand on that? And how do we have equity, and especially in the African-American communities, where that would be where we would have a higher level of communication, a higher level of dialogue, higher level of information sharing, a higher level of engagement, not just by the police, but by the community, because the partnership, everybody's a part of public safety. It's not just the police. So if I could look at, as we move forward, an area where I feel like we have a great room for improvement. And I'm finding even in this discourse right now, people will say, "How come you don't?" For example, we demand that you ban chokeholds, and there's about 8 different things on that list. We do all those things. We've done all those things, and we're saying, "Hey, we want to go much further than that." We're not satisfied with just saying we're doing that 1 or 2 thing. We're not going to just do a press conference and do a press release and say, "Hey, take some pictures and photo op and say, hey, we did that one thing. We checked the box." We want to do so much more. But interestingly, with our Citizens Academy, and when we get a little bit deeper on a lot of these conversations, we actually find a lot more in common than most people in the media and in the community that don't know us well, that we find that we have way more in common, that we're actually at least pointing in the right direction. We're not where we need to be, but we're more closely aligned with where I think a lot of people would demand that we should be. And so that means that we're failing to communicate that very well or very effectively. So how do we bridge those gaps? How do we build and strengthen those relationships? How do we get that dialogue at a much higher level? And I think with that, that's where we will do better with, we can't arrest our way out of opioids, and we can't arrest our way out of the mental health issues that we have and all the other things that are creating a lot of the inequities. But we can, through a much stronger relationship, I think, be a lot more effective. And I think you're hitting right on the sweet spot of an area where much fruit will come as we invest in relationship.
Thank you. Thank you. Chief Burgess.
Yes, I would like to really see, as a chief of police, a situation where both law enforcement and the community would get rid of that us and them mentality. I believe that it's on the community side as well, that they look at us as them, and sometimes we look at them, the community as them all as well. And like Luther said, we cannot do it by ourselves. We've been trying it for 31 years. It hasn't worked. Yeah, we need to engage ourselves as law enforcement and as a community to look at what or how best we can be working with one another. When I growing up here in North Charleston, I remembered that I'm from Union Heights. I used to live on Georgia Degree projects, and I grew up. The majority of my growing up was Liberty Hill, all 3 Black communities. And I remembered I could really count on my hands how many times I saw the police come through. And when they came through, the police came through and they would wave at you, or they would, they knew Ms. Myrtle down the street, or they knew Mr. Harold that had the sweet shop, or they knew something about your family. And that was true community policing. That's why I'm hoping that my department can get thoroughly immersed in the police relationship model. And the reason why I say it's because whenever you are really truly trying to, for instance, if you're a young man and you're trying to date a young lady, you're trying to work your way up to her heart, but it takes steps to get there. But while you're going there, you're learning a whole lot about her. And even if you and her are not in a situation where y'all going to date one another, you'll see a whole lot of good in one another because of the relationship that you were actually engaged in. So I'm looking, I would love to see it where a day that the complaints that the community has is less about law enforcement, and the issues that the police have will be less about the majority of the community. We, both the community and law enforcement, will look at the individuals, that small percentage that are not doing the right things in our community, as well as law enforcement and the community look at some of the officers who do not want to be a part of the community policing model. It has to work both ways. We, as law enforcement, can't expect the community to say, well, hey man, you guys need to start calling out these drug dealers. You need to call out some of these burglars and robbers. Yeah, but that's all well and good. But then the community says on the other side, well, what are you doing about your bad apples? So I would love to see that day. And your data is right on spot, because your data is what Thurgood Marshall said. He said, it is the spirit and not the form of law that keeps justice alive. And your data shows that if our spirits are true in law enforcement, and the community sees that our spirits are true, you will see change in our communities, and that data would change dramatically because we simply, in law enforcement, we found the way that the community can accept us and say, yeah, maybe 5 years ago, I didn't care for them. Maybe I didn't really like what they were doing, but I understand that they're doing what's best for us.
So Chief Burgess, I want to follow up on that spirit of cooperation. And the
Yes.
last question I want to put to each of you is, what is something that the police and the community can advocate for together, whether it's at the local level or the state level, maybe even the national level, but let's try to keep it local. What is it? Can you think of something that the community and the police can come together around to say, we need to shift this policy, we need to change this law? What would you want to pull in members of your community to advocate for?
Well, one of the things I think that we should advocate for, and there's many things, the hate crime. I mean, man, you have people from different parts of the community that are being preyed upon, that are being victimized, and because the law is not structured to look at it in a realistic manner as it occurred. If a person, just like an individual because they are Jewish descent, that is not an assault. That is not just I don't like you or slap you. That is something that's way beyond just a simple case like that. Or if a person don't like somebody from the LGBT community. I really believe, we have laws in the books for everything. This state needs to get a hate crime bill because that would actually close a lot of things that impacts our communities, that the folks who are being victimized in that sense feel helpless. And the reason why I say that, there's a lot of things I could say, but I just feel that those people are being left out of the arc of protection. They really are. It took many, many years, 200-something years for African Americans, to get their freedom. It took many, many years for women to receive the rights to vote. A lot of things happen. Now we should go ahead and close this thing in. Anybody who's victimized, for reasons other than just because they are a human being, or we need a hate crime bill, man. We really need that, and I would like to see that.
Thank you, Chief Burgess. Chief Reynolds, you want to
I
close this out?
I couldn't agree more with Reggie on that. We're one of 3 states left that doesn't have a hate crime bill. It's kind of a no-brainer in my opinion. I think we're all going to work hard and get that across the finish line this year, I hope. I'd like to see a regional training academy. But the last thing I guess I'll spend a little bit of time on is I believe that we have to be really careful. And we've talked about the criminal justice system. The Criminal Justice Coordinating Commission is doing a great job in this region. Reggie and I talked to Christy Danforth, the director, recently, and there's so many good works that they're doing, and they whole list that you could probably do a separate forum just on that topic, a lot of alternatives and things. But as much as we need to disrupt the prison pipeline, as much as we need to work on the education system, transportation, housing, the impact of flooding, gentrification. I mean, there's so many things that I think have created this lack of equity, and I've never seen it so great where you have the haves up here and the have-nots, and there's such a gap. So there's so much work. But I'll tell you, the communities are also impacted by violent crime. And something that I think we can all come together on is the very small number of offenders who are disproportionately responsible for violent crime, that are carrying guns and are shooting up our communities. There are a small number of people that I believe need to be in jail. And I say that very respectfully, because I would work equally as hard to make sure that we have alternatives for reentry, for employment, and for a lot of other things for the good people who happen to get caught up in the minor crime. And that's the majority who don't belong in jail. who deserve a second chance, who deserve mentors and investment. But I believe that our system is broken in so many different ways. And one of them is that we have violent offenders in our communities, and they're disproportionately affecting our African American communities, where you have people who are shooting up the communities on a regular basis. We know who they are, we're arresting them. And we talk about use of force and incidents that go bad. This small number of people, I believe, we need to demand justice for our communities. If I could give a victim impact statement for the number of mothers that I've spoken to have lost their children, whose community members are afraid to go outside, whose children won't go outside because of the shootings in the neighborhood and the violence. I believe that we have a small number of people that are responsible disproportionately in most of those crimes, the homicides and the shootings. And we need to focus on keeping those people in a different place other than our communities. And I do believe that we could come together to have better outcomes in our criminal justice system. And I thank you for this opportunity and for this great dialogue and for all the good work of the Charleston Forum.
Chief Reynolds, Chief Burgess, thank you for spending part of your, what I'm sure is a busy afternoon with us. And thank you for contributing to this dialogue. And it is an ongoing dialogue. There will be follow-up from this conversation where we'll identify some potential policy proposals to carry forward for the community. So we thank you for your willingness to engage, and certainly thank you for your service. Take care.